Philip had planned the entire mountain trip as a ruse, hoping to catch his wife in the act. For weeks, he'd harbored suspicions about Grace's fidelity, noticing small changes that felt out of place. But Grace was clever, calculating even, and up until now, she had maintained a careful web of secrets and lies. When Philip told Grace about his trip, her face lit up a little too much. "Be safe up there," she'd said, grinning in a way that only confirmed his suspicions. Watching her, Philip felt a pang of regret for having to resort to this, his own wife, leading a double life under his nose. Arriving home in the early afternoon instead of the following week, Philip parked a block away to avoid alerting her. Slowly, he walked to the front door, savoring the quiet anger building inside. If his suspicions were correct, he was about to walk into the confirmation he dreaded. He turned the key and quietly slipped inside. Grace's laugh echoed from upstairs, mixing with a hushed voice that unmistakably belonged to another man. Without hesitation, Philip headed up the stairs, feeling his heart pound with each step. As he neared the bedroom, the sounds inside the room grew louder. He opened the door with one quick motion, catching Grace and Patrick, the neighbor mid-embrace. Startled, they sprang apart, each scrambling for a blanket or shirt. The shock on their faces as they turned to Philip was exactly what he'd expected and dreaded. "Grace," he began, his voice steady but laced with hurt. "Why is Patrick in our bed?" Grace stammered, her face paling. "Philip, I'm sorry. It's not what it looks like, or maybe it is, but everything happened so fast. It's not what you think." Philip shifted his gaze to Patrick, who was hastily pulling on his pants. "Patrick," he said with a bitter chuckle, "I thought you were a good neighbor, a friend. You have a wife, yet here you are, naked, in my bed. Care to explain?" Patrick flushed and stammered, avoiding Philip's eyes. "Philip, I didn't mean. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I'm sorry, man." A heavy silence filled the room. "Before you find out what happens next, don't forget to subscribe to the channel." Philip took a steadying breath, absorbing the absurd scene before him, Grace and Patrick both clutching blankets, trying desperately to avoid his gaze. "You two can hardly explain anything, considering the fact that you're naked in my bedroom," he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and simmering anger. "So, let me guess, you're lovers?" Grace's face flushed, and she looked at Philip pleadingly. No, Philip, it's not like that. We're not lovers," she stammered, shaking her head, as though the denial alone would erase the scene from his memory. "This was a mistake, you know? I don't even know how it happened." "A mistake?" Philip echoed, looking at her and then at Patrick, whose own face looked stricken. "How exactly is this supposed to be a mistake?" "We didn't want to hurt anyone," Grace insisted. "I mean, Patrick and I, we were just talking, really." And then, she looked to Patrick for support, as if they could come up with a reasonable explanation together. Patrick shifted awkwardly, trying to recover his composure. "Philip, we really were just talking," he said, fumbling his words. There was this sudden outburst of emotions. Maybe it was a magnetic storm or something. We lost control." Philip raised his eyebrows, barely able to contain his exasperation. "Magnetic storms?" he asked, folding his arms and fixing them both with a look of utter disbelief. "So, let me get this straight, you're saying that some kind of universal influence made you strip down and end up in my bed?" Grace, looking sheepish, nodded. That's right. It just happened, Philip. We didn't mean for it to go this far. I'm really sorry. I know this shouldn't have happened, and I take full responsibility. But it wasn't planned." Philip's voice hardened as he looked between them. "So you're saying this was just some uncontrollable moment? A wild impulse you couldn't resist?" He shook his head. "Grace, you betrayed me. And Patrick, you betrayed your wife. Are either of you even remotely ashamed of this?" Patrick shifted uncomfortably, staring at the floor. "Of course we're ashamed, Philip. It was a one-time thing, truly. Just an accident. We both went out of our minds. I love my wife, you know that. And Grace loves you. It just happened. Is that right, Grace?" Philip turned to her, his gaze sharp. "You didn't want to ruin our marriage, but here you are. Inexplicable reactions, you say? Grace nodded, her eyes wide and desperate. Philip, we were just having coffee. You'd gone on your trip and Lily was out for the day, and it was just us talking. But then, somehow we ended up here. I know it sounds crazy, but it felt like some sort of obsession. Like a force out of our control. A force? Really? Philip asked, incredulous. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you two made one choice after another, until you wound up exactly where you are right now. Grace and Patrick looked at each other, then back at Philip, both nodding in unison. It was the first and last time. I swear, Grace said earnestly, we weren't involved before. This was just what? Philip interrupted, his tone laced with disappointment. One harmless conversation after another, talking about the weather, life, politics, until somehow you wound up in bed together. Both of them nodded, clutching the sheets like life rafts, desperately trying to cling to the hope that he might believe their story. But Philip only stood there, his face unreadable. Philip stared at them both, his face filled with a mix of disappointment and anger. I'm ashamed to even look at you, he said slowly, his voice carrying a calm weight that made both Grace and Patrick squirm. He turned to Patrick first, his gaze hardening. You, Patrick. I considered you a reliable neighbor, someone I trusted. I treated you like a friend. I even helped you whenever you needed it. And this, he gestured around the room, is how you repay that trust. Patrick lowered his eyes, visibly uncomfortable. Philip, I'm really sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I really do consider you a friend. Believe me, this just happened. It's not what it looks like. Oh, it's exactly what it looks like. Philip shot back, before turning his gaze to Grace. She looked small, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. And you, Grace. His voice broke slightly as he continued. I loved you. I trusted you with my whole heart. Our son, he thought we were the perfect couple. He was proud of us. At the mention of their son, Grace's face crumpled and she began to cry. Philip, I'm sorry, she said between sobs. I didn't mean for this to happen. It's not my fault. It's just a terrible coincidence. A terrible coincidence? Philip repeated with a wry laugh. A coincidence is two people bumping into each other at the grocery store. Grace. This, he gestured around the room. This isn't a coincidence. Patrick looked up, trying to keep his composure. Look, Philip, I know this looks terrible, but I swear, I didn't mean for any of this to happen either. I'm sorry, man. Philip narrowed his eyes. Sorry? Patrick, you have 2 children. Family. And you betrayed them. You betrayed your marriage. And you betrayed me. Our friendship for what? Fleeting pleasure. At this, Patrick's face flushed. Leave my family out of this, Philip. He snapped, his tone bristling with defensiveness. I love my family, but sometimes adults make mistakes. I have the right to make mistakes. Grace gave a slight snort, rolling her eyes. Philip, we all make mistakes. That's human. But it doesn't have to ruin everything we've built. We can learn from this, can't we? Philip's eyes, cold and unyielding, locked onto hers. Tell me, how long have you been having sex? His question was piercing, leaving no room for evasion. Grace and Patrick exchanged a quick glance before they both answered in unison. It was just once. Just today. We swear. Philip's gaze never wavered, his expression a mix of disbelief and disdain. Are you sure? He asked, his tone challenging them to lie again. Grace threw up her hands, exasperated. For God's sake, Philip, it was just once. Today, Patrick nodded, holding up a hand as if he were making an oath. I swear to God. Philip. Just once. Philip shook his head slowly, his expression one of utter contempt. You're both disgusting liars. You don't even respect God. Not if you're willing to lie in his name. Aren't you ashamed? Patrick and Grace both spoke up at once, their voices loud, defensive, and desperate. We're not lying. It's the truth. Grace took a shaky breath, clutching at her blanket as she looked at Philip, her eyes filled with pleading. Philip, everyone makes mistakes. That's why mercy and forgiveness exist. Don't you see? We all need forgiveness sometimes. Don't forget that. Philip stared at her, his expression hardening as he absorbed her words. Philip looked at them both, his voice low but firm. This entire situation reeks of divorce and consequences. For both of you. Grace's head shot up, her face pale. Divorce? Philip, no. She protested, her voice filled with urgency. We don't need any divorce. One mistake shouldn't be enough to blow everything up. I mean, yes, we've messed up, but we can fix this. We'll need time. Sure. But it's not worth making such a drastic, hasty decision. Just think about it. Patrick nodded quickly, eager to support her plea. She's right, Philip. Divorce is nothing but legal red tape. My brother's a lawyer, so trust me, I know how messy it gets. We're all friends here. Let's not make this worse by going down that road. We can figure out a way to resolve this calmly. Philip's eyes were icy as he turned to Patrick. Tell me, Patrick, are you planning to confess this mistake to your wife? Patrick hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. I can be honest with her if I need to be, he said slowly, but I think it would just make things worse for everyone involved. I don't want to lose my family, and I don't want you to lose yours either. Maybe the best thing here is for us all to just take a step back, stay calm, and work through this rationally. Philip clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. Enough, he snapped. The anger in his voice was unmistakable, causing both Grace and Patrick to flinch. I'm tired of your filthy lies. The two looked at him with a mix of shock and fear as Philip's gaze hardened. Do you think I'm blind? Or just naive? I know the whole truth. I've been collecting evidence for 3 months. Grace's face drained of color. What do you mean? She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Look around, Philip said, his voice calm yet laced with menace. Check the corners of this room, or better yet, don't bother. I'll save you the trouble. Reaching into a drawer, he pulled out a small hidden camera. There are cameras everywhere. Grace gasped, her face crumbling as she covered it with her hands, her shoulders shaking as fresh tears began to fall. Patrick, on the other hand, looked dazed, rubbing his forehead as though to steady himself. You both just lied to me, Philip continued, his words clipped. But I've known everything from the start. And you thought you were being so clever, didn't you? Well, newsflash, I'm not an idiot. And Patrick, there are cameras in your house, too. Patrick's face went from red to ghostly white. Before he could muster a response, Philip reached for his phone, tapping on the screen with controlled precision. A few moments later, the door to the bedroom opened, and there stood Lily, Patrick's wife. She looked around the room, her face a mask of hurt and quiet devastation. The silence that followed was deafening as she took in the scene, her gaze lingering on her husband with a mixture of sadness and disgust. Philip looked between Grace and Patrick, his voice now cold and clear. Now, he said, we're all here. Let's see if you still think it was just a mistake. Patrick muttered under his breath, his face twisted in shock. What the hell is going on? He looked from Lily to Philip, panic clear in his eyes. Lily took a slow, deep breath, her expression filled with pain. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she held up her phone, her fingers trembling. I saw everything, Patrick. I heard everything, she said, her voice breaking. How could you? Grace's sobs filled the silence, but Lily didn't even look in her direction. Her gaze was locked on Patrick, her disappointment cutting through the room. She turned to Philip, her voice soft but steady. Philip, I trusted you, and now I see that trust wasn't misplaced. But after everything we've seen, after all we've gathered, she shook her head, her voice filled with a finality that left no room for doubt. Patrick, when I saw you and Grace at our house, I hesitated. I thought I could forgive you for the sake of the kids. But now I realize that's impossible. Patrick opened his mouth to speak, scrambling out of bed. Lily, wait. I can explain everything, he pleaded, stumbling over his words. But Lily raised a hand, stopping him cold. I don't need your explanations, she replied, her tone colder than he'd ever heard it. Save them for your brother, the lawyer, the one you were so eager to mention a few minutes ago. And Patrick, you know he's a religious man. Do you have any idea how much pain this is going to cause him? The words hit Patrick like a blow. His shoulders slumped, and he sank back down onto the bed, his face a mask of despair. Philip, who had been watching in silence, finally spoke. His voice was calm but laced with disgust. "For 3 months, I've been gathering evidence," he said, looking at both Grace and Patrick with an expression that was equal parts disappointment and contempt. "I have everything. The late-night meetings, the texts, the afternoons you spent together. And now my lawyer is preparing the divorce papers." He turned to Grace, his expression softening for only a second before hardening again. "Grace, I'm ashamed. Not only of what you did, but of the fact that you were too cowardly to own up to it. Too weak to admit the truth." Grace sobbed loudly, clutching the sheets to her chest. Patrick sat on the bed, his head hung low, shoulders hunched in utter defeat. The room was thick with the weight of their failures, each of them caught in their lies with no way out. Philip looked between them, his voice calm but cutting. "You wanted to bury this under more lies, to call it a mistake as though that would make it all go away." He let out a hollow chuckle. "It's not just a mistake. It's a betrayal. And now, thanks to your own choices, you both get to live with the consequences." Lily nodded, her gaze cold and resolute. The weight of betrayal had already settled on her, and she wasn't about to let Patrick wriggle free with another empty apology. The truth was out in the open now, and for both Grace and Patrick, there was nowhere left to hide. The divorce proceedings moved swiftly, each step heavy with the weight of betrayal and loss. Philip sat through the hearings, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. His plan had been thorough, his evidence irrefutable. Everything he'd hoped to uncover had come to light, and yet, even as the judge finalized the divorce, a deep sadness gnawed at him. He had once believed in a life with Grace, a future where they'd grow old together. Now, that hope lay shattered, swept away by her betrayal with a man he had once called a friend. Their son, Ralph, was at his father's side through it all. He'd barely looked at Grace since the truth came out, his face tense with anger and disbelief. In court, Ralph's expressions spoke volumes. He'd gone from a son who idolized his mother to one who could hardly stand to be in the same room with her. He had always admired the bond his parents shared, a marriage he believed was unbreakable. But seeing Grace's actions laid bare in court changed everything. The boy had lost not only his trust in her, but a sense of family that had once been his pride. For Patrick, things unraveled even more painfully. Lily, fierce and unyielding, fought for everything in the divorce, and she won. Patrick's brother, furious over the betrayal and the disgrace it had brought upon the family, stood firmly on Lily's side, ensuring that Patrick faced the full consequences. With his brother's support, Lily secured the house, custody of the children, and even the maximum child support, leaving Patrick with little more than the clothes on his back. The betrayal had cost him everything: his marriage, his family, and his brother's respect. Grace, meanwhile, was a shadow of herself by the time the trial ended. The truth had unraveled her completely. The humiliation of having her affair exposed in such brutal detail left her broken, ashamed to even show her face in their small community. Her once proud demeanor had been replaced by a haunted expression, as though the weight of her choices would never let her rest. She was left not only with a broken marriage, but a lifetime of regret for the betrayal that had destroyed 2 families and wounded everyone she'd once held dear. As the courtroom emptied for the last time, Philip walked out with Ralph by his side, his son's support a bittersweet comfort in the wake of all he had lost. Patrick slumped in his chair, staring blankly ahead, and Grace remained seated, her face hidden behind trembling hands. The affair had carved deep scars into all their lives, leaving them to navigate a future shaped by choices they could never take back. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more. Your thoughts mean a lot, so drop your reactions in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Wishing you all a fantastic day and the best of luck.